Here we go.
Well, welcome to this most recent episode of the Akkad and Koga Report. Today we have the pleasure of having Peter Kolchinsky here. Peter Kolchinsky is a biotechnology investor and a scientist. He started his career as a scientist. He's actually a virologist, and then he went on to co-found and run a Boston-based investment firm called RA Capital Management that's very successful and invests in new drug therapies. He now writes and teaches about biomedical entrepreneurship, and he's here to talk about his most recent book, which is really great, really fascinating, called The Great American Drug Deal. So, Peter, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Peter, can you tell me what was some of the impetus to writing the book? Obviously, a lot of people write books to give some insight, to push back on something. What was your specific reason to write the book?
Yeah, it didn't start off as a book. I think that's too daunting for anybody with a full-time job to tackle, or at least it would have been for me. I was focused on finding interesting companies to invest in that were developing new types of drugs, steeped in the science. And right around middle of 2015, when a company called Turing Pharmaceuticals took an old drug and price jacked it like 5,000%. Hillary Clinton tweeted, about it, and that was the first step down a steep precipice for the industry, and the sector was really thrown into turmoil as the public, connected the dots from the high prices that it perceived for hepatitis C drugs through to that, price jacking insult, and it was an insult, and I write about that in the book. The sector dropped. You could see it in the stock indices, and investment started to cool a bit. And I thought, all right, well, this industry is sort of well versed in dealing with public outcries over high drug prices, and comes back from it and has answers, and we've got lobby groups, and surely I'm going to hear some cogent responses. And I was kind of disappointed by what I heard. They weren't entirely satisfying answers. You would hear patients cry out saying, I can't afford my insulin. And the industry seemed to respond with, well, drug development is very expensive and it's high risk and all that. And that wasn't an answer to the patient's question, right? An answer would have been, that's terrible. You have to be able to afford your insulin. Companies, scientists didn't invent this stuff in order for you not to be able to afford it. That's what we rely on proper insurance for. Now, if the question you're asking is America getting value for its drugs, which of course is not really what patients are asking, it's maybe what health economists are asking. But if that's what you're asking, well, then there's another answer that the industry wasn't giving, and it's that, yes, most certainly, drugs are the most cost-effective aspect of healthcare because they are a manufactured, commodity, and after their patents expire and competition sets in, they drop in price. They go generic. It's the best value proposition that there is in healthcare. Nothing else about healthcare goes generic. Not hospitals, not surgery. And nobody was saying that. Everybody was focused on on trying to justify the high prices of today's drugs based on today's value proposition, and they weren't making a case that these drugs are upgrading human health for the rest of all time. And I waited, and I thought, well, somebody will make these arguments, but they didn't. I remember, with the election, last election, I went in search of sort of answers in American history, for how does this country deal with turmoil and adversity and, stress in the executive branch, to put it mildly. And I went reading the biographies of, the founding fathers. I read Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton, the one that sparked the musical, which I haven't seen yet, but I've listened to the lyrics and they're great. And the biography was terrific. And, it tells a story of somebody who really understood the workings of a government, of a society, like truly at the most fundamental levels, understood how finance worked and taxation worked, and helped draft the social contract at the root of America. The Constitution, together with the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. And there was a moment in time when it wasn't clear whether or not that social contract would pass, whether the Constitution would be ratified. And he and Madison and Jay wrote their hearts out in defense of the workings of the Constitution, to try to defend it before all of its critics, and published their articles in the various newspapers around the country back at the time. And anything that the public seemed to not understand about the Constitution, the need for two branches and federal taxes and a centralized army and all that, they explained and explained and explained as best they could. And later on, those articles were published together and called the Federalist Papers. But I can't imagine that's quite, that was their intent. I think they just tried to explain everything they could when it felt so urgent to make sure the Constitution passed. And they succeeded. And so I thought, okay, well, I don't know if I can write, as many articles as Hamilton, Madison, and Jay did, but, I've got a few in my head. And I just sat down and started writing. And I thought, okay, I will defend this notion of a biotech social contract, a phrase, by the way, that I had heard the CEO of Allergan, Brent Saunders, use. And he defined the social contract as, we shall not raise prices by more than single digits. And I was pretty sure that something as glorious as a biotech social contract can't quite be that. And it struck me that what it could be is a promise by our industry to make drugs that will go generic without undue delay, and a commitment to doing so, and a promise by society to make all drugs, branded or generic, affordable to patients through proper insurance, which means not having out-of-pocket costs so high that people have to go without treatments their doctors tell them are necessary. And so I wrote those articles, and when they finally came out, they were met with a lot of interest, and I got a lot of support from the industry. I had thought that maybe if I'd made a mistake somewhere in my logic, that that would be the point where I'd hear about it. People would poke holes in them, but they didn't. I was invited to give more talks, and the audience interrogated aspects of the social contract, and it certainly helped evolve my thinking and led to more articles. And I baby stepped my way from one article to another until finally I looked at the totality of what I had posted on Medium, and I thought, oh, this shouldn't be too hard to turn into a book. I'll just staple them together. And I was really wrong about that. There's a vast difference between a set of articles and a book, and several really great editors schooled me in that, shredded all my writing, and forced me to work with them to put together a cogent book with new chapters, and it had to fit together a lot better than my articles did. So writing the actual book was the last step that I thought would take 3 months, and it took more like a year, but it's done.
And you, and I think one of the things I really loved about the book is you really have a way of clarifying the argument, clarifying your arguments in support of the drug industry, and in support of innovation, and in support of the pharmaceutical industry and all the benefits that it has to society, and how one should go about paying for it in a way that's much clearer than most of the stuff that we read. I want to, and as you're saying, you kind of approach this because you were triggered, if you will, by the conversation that seemed to be kind of missing some pretty important points that you bring out nicely in your book. And so we'll focus in on some of them. So there's a nice passage in your book early on, and you talk about needing to reframe how one thinks about the pharmaceutical industry and the drugs that they produce as not so much as rent but mortgage. So you say, when you pay a high and growing price for an apartment forever, that's called rent. When you pay a high price for an apartment for a defined period of time and then you own it, that's a mortgage.
That's right.
Those expressing outrage at the high price of brand drugs are in a way thinking of a mortgage payment as if it were rent. a rent is an expense, a mortgage payment is an investment, and no one was making that point. And so, and this builds on, the thing that I think you're right about is missed a lot in the debate, is that these drugs do go, or a significant portion of these drugs that have pretty large, certainly some population benefits, some individual benefits, like statins and whatnot. When they go generic, they're kind of benefiting society kind of forever, and so you've kind of put in that investment so the entire globe can then enjoy these drugs. And then the other point that you bring out is that the reason high drug prices aren't people talk a lot about it is because of the high out-of-pocket costs that have kind of come to bear. A lot of it as part of the kind of changes to both the private and the public insurance, private and public markets when it comes to insurance over the last 10 years. So I want to kind of hit both of those points. One is when you talk about the investment that one makes, how do you decide, Peter, what that investment should be?
Yeah, so under the regime, under the framework that we've been operating with for the last, basically my whole career, where there's been a confidence that America values life. When it sees suffering, it wants to help, and it will not place a value on life. At the very least, the value it places on life is very high, right? What it has allowed, I believe, scientists, people in the biotechnology industry to do is to, for the most part, focus on what can we do? Technically speaking, what problems can we solve? And to know that as long as it's doable, if we then pursue those solutions with certain probability adjustments, that when we bring those drugs to market, we will be able to charge prices that will have made it worthwhile. Now, that breaks down, right? If, let's just say that one says, well, if we can make at least $500 million a year with this drug, for the time period when the patents last, that's a high enough net present value to justify the risks and the costs of this particular development program. Well, $500 million divided by how many patients? Now, if you're thinking at the societal level and you say, this problem that we have, I would gladly pay $500 million times 15 years, which adds up to $7.5 billion. I would gladly pay that in order to know that we've fixed this problem once and for all, right? Then that's one way of doing the math. But when you have to arbitrarily say that we're going to pay for that kind of insurance value, that reassurance that we now have a tool to solve a problem by dividing by the number of people that are going to get it each year, and it turns out that there are, 500? Okay, well then that's $1 million per patient. And so the question is, given that I have to charge $1 million per patient, for this, in order to make the math work, do I believe that we are operating or will operate at the time that we launch in the kind of climate that will accept that? And if the answer is no, I'd be too nervous. I don't think I would want to be backing a company that's got to justify $1 million per patient to the public. Then it may not get funded. Now, if it happens to be that it's 5,000 patients, then it becomes possible to make the math work, because $100,000 per patient per year is precedented. That isn't what sets off alarm bells, typically. And the aggregate cost of $500 million, per year is generally not what insurance companies freak out about. And so if there's a disease with 5,000 patients, then we say, okay, well, at $100,000 per patient, yes, that's doable, right? And so that's pretty much, how we gauge whether or not the public will, if not embrace, then at least accept or not vilify that drug if we launch it. If I had to now ask the question, yes, but when later on there's some government agency or a group like ICER that will run some math after the fact, after we've taken whatever risks we've taken to try to bring this drug to market, gee, I wonder what value they will assign using their particular formulas, then that's a degree of uncertainty that would, I think, preclude investing in a whole lot of things. In fact, I'm not entirely sure what we would invest in if we knew that we would only get paid what a group like ICER says our successes are worth. And their math is deeply flawed.
Right. No, and you nicely do bring up the fact that, for instance, the ICER, I guess, doesn't, and I didn't know this actually, ICER doesn't take into account the value of when a drug does go generic, correct? So there's a limited time frame that they're kind of looking at and stuff.
Yeah, they treat mortgage payments like rent.
Right. Do you see, Peter, the issues with, do you see any issues with kind of the game, which is, which basically says the rules are that I'm going to come up with this important drug, and then I'm going to, because I have a patent and it's, it's exclusive, I get to choose what the price is. I mean, so the pushback, in some sense comes from, you get to choose whatever price it is you want to pick for a drug. It's, of course, healthcare is such a, healthcare is such a challenge because, of course, in other markets, the consumer can walk away from a product that's being produced. And in this particular case, there are products that end up getting produced that, folks can't walk away from because it could be a difference between life and death, and how one exactly deals with that is a challenge. And that's why it gets thrown onto society. And then, but isn't this a kind of a match between folks that are saying that, we're society and we're saying that we don't want to pay this massive investment.
I totally hear you. I would rather. How do we? I hear it in part. This is the twisted part of the problem. Some people, as they convey what you're saying, they accidentally end up saying something to the effect of, "I wish you hadn't invented cures for hepatitis C, because then I wouldn't be on the horns of the dilemma of the fact that I have to pay for it." Right? It's like, I wish no such cure existed, and then I would just accept my fate, which, by the way, is to spend even more, treating, the progression of hepatitis C with the only technologies we've got, which is, transplant, or just outright accepting, suffering and death. So I take your point that the public feels uncomfortable with the idea that the industry, when it does achieve a technological success and a regulatory success, there is the FDA to make sure that the drugs that come to market are better than what we had before, the public worries, what if we will be taken advantage of, our desperation will be taken advantage of, and a company will just charge $1 billion a patient, right? And the question is, has that really happened? If someone were to take advantage, to prey upon the public like that, upon patients and the mercy of America, then wouldn't the industry's profit margins be way higher? It's awfully strange that when you do the math on the whole industry, if you just simply shaved 20 or 30% off of US drug prices, you would drop the industry's profit down to basically zero, wipe out executive compensation. Everything that the American public has been taught to hate will be wiped out. And yet a 20, 30% discount off of American prices, is that going to make these drugs affordable to patients? No, right? And so it's strange. The industry does not seem to be systematically taking advantage of this ability to price gouge that the public is, sort of guided to fear. So I don't believe that we need to be imposing controls on prices to prevent something that isn't happening, with the exception of outliers like Turing Pharmaceuticals and Daraprim, and there are fixes for that, like the Creates Act.
Right, right. So that and so one of the interesting things that you bring up is that when this the contract that you're talking about that you want folks to kind of cleave to is this idea that drugs need to go generic, because when they go generic, there's massive benefit to society, and there are biosimilars, which are not just mixing chemicals together or chemicals mixed together in a certain way. Those are very unique, and it may be very hard or impossible to create equivalent biosimilars. And I guess
we could talk about the cocktail and the wine analogies if you like.
Right, exactly, right. So you nicely explained how if there are compounds that are being made, if there are drugs that are being made that are biosimilars that are unable to be to go generic easily, you'd be okay with governments or regulations that compel, after the patent expires, that compel companies to allow generics to be made, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the intent of patents is to offer a finite period of time for the innovator to be able to, charge a high price and collect a reward for that innovation. You can't entirely have a monopoly if others are able to invent something similar and compete with you. But at least no one's going to directly rip off, what you've created, and others are forced to innovate too. But sometimes the monopoly you have is not rooted in a patent. It's rooted in essentially the complexities of science and the rigors of the regulatory process, like a gene therapy. And the FDA just doesn't have any mechanism for saying that somebody else's gene therapy is the same as yours and substitutable, and therefore a pharmacy can just switch out the brand for the generic. And so when you enjoy a red tape monopoly like that, or what an economist would probably call a natural monopoly, then we have kind of the opposite of a patent. It's a price regulation that steps in and makes sure that our free market system is not hijacked by natural monopolies. And we've done it with other natural monopolies like railroads and water utilities. And that's what these are, by the way. Like these drugs, once they're invented, they're destined to become public goods, right? They are ours. They are our shared resource. Society will have paid off the mortgage. It owns it. And therefore it's entitled to have that public good at pretty much as close to the cost of production as will preserve that supply, right?
Peter,
so I think the regulation I'm proposing is just a natural fix for a market failure.
So Peter, I didn't see much in the book about the FDA, and you're very positive on the FDA. I mean, in terms of Michelle and I have had a couple of podcasts where we've brought up the high entry barrier that the FDA places in terms of their requirement for efficacy. I mean, the FDA's history is interesting in terms of going from an organization that was primarily concerned with safety to now one that is essentially is followed so closely by the investor community, right? Because if the FDA approves a drug, especially in a market where if an FDA approves it, payers will pay. You have kind of a known windfall, if you will, that happens if the FDA
more or less known. I mean, it's a lot harder to guess what the sales of a drug would be. Companies
these days.
Well, it's been like this for a while.
Okay.
I heard, when Pfizer launched Lipitor, they thought it would be a rather modest selling drug. That's a rare case of a drug selling more than a company expected. Usually they sell a lot less.
Okay. But do you not have any issues, especially as an investor, as somebody who's been on the kind of under the covers, if you will, kind of drug development in terms of, do you have any issues with the FDA and the bars that they have in order, the cost that they kind of put on folks like you to get a drug to market?
I think it's really important that the world and America, patients, that they have somebody that is kind of sworn to uphold science and clinical standard for something as complicated as drug development. Um, I've got a book next to my bed that I've been flipping through here and there called, I think, Quackery. And it's just kind of a fun book to go back and see how people used to treat themselves with mercury and arsenic and the most obscene things. I mean, and not really that long ago. It's frightening, and implanting goat testicles. And I mean, the stuff that con artists will come up with to prey upon vulnerable people. Uh, you know, you think you find some folks engaged in predatory practices today. It was like, it seems to be all predatory. And the worst is that some of them actually believed it. They weren't predators. They really thought that, exsanguinating somebody, is a good treatment for just about everything, or making them vomit like crazy, right? Like they
Right.
truly
But
believed it.
but yet without the FDA, we progressed from leashing somehow, right? Without the FDA, we've progressed in all sorts of different ways. Meaning, so
Well,
is it that we
yeah,
needed the
very,
FDA?
very slowly. Very, very slowly we
Yeah.
have progressed. You can go back through a medical history book and you can
Yeah.
find how long it took, hygiene to, make its way into hospitals. So when you then look at the rate of progression, the rate of progress today, I think that we would be held back dramatically if there weren't a regulator holding companies to a high standard of proof. And I think that we have the mechanisms, by the way, even without the FDA, to reveal that a drug is more dangerous than we thought, right? So now imagine, what kind of faith would America have in medicines if the news that a particular drug that you thought was safe, even just, you guys have covered the generic drug industry and how, we discover that some of those products are tainted.
Yeah.
Imagine if you had no idea which drugs you could trust,
Right. Right.
and
Of
then
course.
you would
Oh,
say, oh, I prescribed this statin for you. And a patient would look at you
yeah.
and be like, nah, I'm going to go with, I don't know,
Right.
water and dieting or
Right.
something.
Though as I mean, the interesting thing with that story is that it was, there's is that there are it took whistleblowers, outside of the that weren't in the FDA to kind of clue people into what was going on. And then the most interesting part of it is that there's a company in Boston, I think, I forget where exactly, and somewhere in the Northeast, that is actually batch testing every single pocket of drugs that they get to see if they have what they say they have. So in some senses,
Yeah,
they're doing a lot more than what the
you've got
FDA
to have
does. So
watchdogs.
right. So the point is that it may be that if you didn't have just one large regulatory body like the FDA that is giving this kind of certification, and some of the certifications, as you saw, that whole with the generic drug mess that we have in India with Ranbaxy and stuff, that kind of certification means next to nothing. Maybe you'd have a bunch of different.
I think it's great that we've got the FDA.
Yeah. Okay.
And I definitely think there's things that the FDA could do better.
Do better.
Any group of people, there are mechanisms for them to evolve, and
Right.
they feedback. But besides the FDA, I think it's great that we've got watchdogs. I think it's great that Catherine Eben wrote that book, Bottle of Lies. And while not everything in that book, I would say, reflects on the totality of the generics industry, I think it's a little harsh. I also don't think that it was her job to be nice and totally balanced. You need a book like that to wake up our entire all of America to how important it is to make sure that the generic supply can be relied upon. In fact, when I saw that book, my heart sank, because I thought, here I am writing my own book about the value of branded drugs because they go generic and they remain effective and reliable and inexpensive for the rest of all time. And here is this book saying that's a lie. And I immediately, pinged some of the people that I know in the industry, including people that have been at the FDA, and I said, "Is this true?" And they said, "It's a lot better now than it was." So I hope that we continue to guarantee the generic supply. I would gladly see every branded drug, a tax imposed upon it in order to fund additional resources for either the FDA, or you make up what watchdog you want, to quality test every generic batch out there so that the public has faith. Because it's only by knowing that after you've paid off the mortgage on your house, it's actually going to remain erect and, function and serve you and be, still a good home for your kids when you pass it on to them, that makes the mortgage worth paying.
Right. That's a great point. There are of course a bunch of folks that have different views on how to control drug prices, right? There's the camp. I think Peter Bach is fairly prominent, and he wants to control drug prices, use some formula based on some value thing. John Arnold, is seemingly everywhere, and has funded a number of different organizations. And his point is that a drug's price should be linked to its clinical value to patients. And again, he highlights the fact that drugs in the United States are much more expensive than drugs in the US. So drugs outside the US are much more expensive than drugs here. So therefore, that has led to some folks, talking about using those prices as a reference for U.S. prices. There's you and I exchanged a bunch of tweets a couple of weeks ago about this story of the state of Utah, sending people in limos to Mexico to buy drugs to bring them back. Tell me why all of those are wrongheaded.
All of those. Wow. Okay. So,
well, you can start with, so just drug price, just capping drug prices and then getting drugs from other countries. So just those 2 points.
Why don't we start with the idea of there being formulas? So the industry already operates off of a rather broad formula, which is what I described before. It's, generally how big a win do you need? And for a rare, genetic condition, that biology on that might be straightforward enough. You might say $500 million a year for 10 to 15 years. That would be a big enough win. Divide that by the number of patients. And if the cost per patient doesn't look like it's going to fall far outside of what's precedented, you basically say, all right, let's go for it. And hopefully we'll succeed. This will be a value to patients. And I know that I'm doing God's work, even if someday ICER won't value it, because this product will go generic, and we will never have to worry about this disease in the same way ever again. And that's worth it, right? But obviously, if you divide that $500 million by 5 patients, and it turns out you're going to have to charge $100 million per patient, we're not willing to do it. So there is a formula that basically causes our industry to say, let's not do quite all that we can. What others, whether it's the Arnold Foundation or Peter Bach or Patients for Affordable Drugs or ICER, which, by the way, all of those are funded by the Arnold Foundation. So I suppose it all comes down to John Laura Arnold, but still, the ideas that they are, putting out there and funding, they pre-existed them. They didn't invent these ideas. They were always there, and they've been magnified. And the fundamental idea that there are better formulas that will more precisely tell us what these things are worth, it's really easy to dismiss that quite simply by the fact that already economists have shredded ICER for failing to take into account that drugs go generic. It's basically like, looking at somebody who's paying $2,000 a month and saying, oh, you're such a fool. You're paying, $500 more than the other guy, living next to you. And at no point did you ask which one of them's paying the mortgage and which one's paying rent, right? And it's such a foolish mistake, that any health economist that actually does that should not qualify to be called an economist, right? And this has been pointed out, and they have not corrected this. So ICER is a political organization, much like NICE, by the way. I had a conversation with somebody at NICE, and I pointed out, it's like, hey, if you guys build a model over time that takes into account that society pays high prices for 15 years, but then virtually nothing for the rest of all time, but meanwhile it gets, decades and decades and basically an eternity of QALYs, then at a 2 or 3% cost of capital, you divide a century's worth of cost, which is really just 15 years worth of high cost, by a century's worth of QALYs. And these drugs are way more cost effective. In fact, if you bother to do the math, you'll find that these ICER values, these cost effectiveness values, drop by about 65%. And he said, now that I think about it, you're right, that is what most likely would happen with the math. I'm like, great, so is NICE going to change its formulas now? He's like, no, because that doesn't serve our interests. We're not here to show how cost-effective drugs are. We're here to push back on drug prices, right? So it shows you NICE's true colors. And, ICER is basically the American NICE. And, I think that we need, somebody who's going to shred these formulas and reveal them for the heartless, flawed half-truths and flawed math that they are, in order to, get the discussion going again as to, is there really a way to value these things? By the way, not after they come out. Playing Monday morning quarterback is not exactly an appropriate way, to engage with an industry that spends 10 years developing a drug. But how about ahead of time? Like, I'd like to see ICER or anybody tell us, so what would you pay for a treatment that improves the lives of patients with Alzheimer's? Just tell me now. Because if your number is too low and I plug it in and, it's like, wow, so we're going to take these incredibly long odds, we're going to pump in a ton of money, and at the end of it, your reward is this small. Okay, then we won't do it. Like, we can't do it. It's not that, I wouldn't like to see progress on Alzheimer's. It's a really scary disease that's coming for an awful lot of us. But I can't ask my investors to take their savings. I can't ask pension funds, endowments, any of these kinds of people to risk their savings pursuing a project that basically is philanthropy. Like, you'll never make your money back. There's room for philanthropy, but by all means, and maybe the Arnold Foundation and others can fund research into Alzheimer's out of the goodness of their heart and all. But those dollars are so much smaller than the dollars that the private sector can put to work when it's allowed to offer investors a financial return, the promise of financial return, right? And it's not like it's going to cost them a lot less, to do this. The difference between the pharmaceutical sector and doing everything as a nonprofit is what, that 15% profit margin or so that they have. So, people who think that suddenly if a nonprofit did it, that it would only cost, a tenth of the price to develop these drugs, are missing the fact that it's going to cost you the same to enroll patients in clinical trials, the lab work, and then the failure rate is going to be, the same. There's no reason to think that nonprofits would, magically be blessed with higher success rates. So I have not yet seen anybody who supports, ICER type formulas offer to use those formulas to tell us ahead of time what will something be worth. They just sit on their formulas quietly until a drug for sickle cell anemia is launched, and then they judge after the fact how easy it was and tell us how little it's worth and how greedy and terrible the industry for charging what it's charging, right? All the while not valuing the fact that that drug is going to go generic, and consciously not valuing it. Tell me that's not a political agenda.
No, lots of political agendas here. What about? Tell me about what's your problem with the reference pricing? Like Americans are getting
Yeah.
the thing you hear, Americans getting ripped off. Look at how much the Canadians and Mexicans pay for the same drugs.
Yeah. So the the analogy that I would use is, and I'm still working on this analogy, so bear with me. But there's a house with a number of rooms, and we want to live there. We are the primary tenant, and we are making mortgage payments, and we've got these roommates, European roommates, let's say, and Canadian roommates, and we would like them to pay, proportionately, for the mortgage payments to help us pay off the house. But they say, no, look, I'll just couch surf a bit, and I won't eat quite as much as you. I promise not to be as messy. I'm just going to pitch in a little bit, right? And it irks you because you know that what will happen is after you've paid off the mortgage, they will move in full. They'll claim a room. They'll use those generic drugs fully, right? They'll move their families in. They'll enjoy, the benefits of having paid off that house after the drug goes generic. But they're really not willing to do anything more than pitch in for the mortgage payments a bit, right? And so as much as you kind of want to throw them out and say that's just not fair, the reality is that you will only be robbing yourself of the supplemental payments that they're offering, that little bit of pitching in, and you'll end up paying more. So if there were a way to force them to pay their fair share through trade negotiations, what have you, that would be great. Like, I fully support the American administration's efforts to try to get other countries to pay their fair share for basically everything that they should be paying their fair share for. Way back when Canada was ripping off drug patents, we actually engaged with them in some negotiations, and the outcome was NAFTA, and Canadians got in line and they respected drug patents after that. So it is possible to achieve greater fairness with negotiations. But if what you say to basically the home builders is, look, it's so unfair that I have to pay more than my couch surfing roommate here. I insist that I'm only going to pay what he's paying. Then that may feel more fair to you, but the home builder is like, but I can't actually make my business work. I can't build homes for people if everybody just pitches in what they can, right? And so as the primary mortgage bearer, you can't just say that's it. I'm just going to be a couch surfing roommate. Someone else bears this cost. The whole industry does indeed depend to a large extent on America, and America cannot forsake its duties to its own patients. Other countries are taking advantage of that. So the IPI, the International Price Index, as it's proposed, just in its most pure form, could actually have an unintended consequence if indeed America is still intent on funding innovation to help its patients. By saying that the primary tenant, us, and all of our roommates have to pay the same fraction, the same fair price, if it results in driving them out, then in other words, if American companies basically set the same US price exported to Europe, and we discover that the Europeans really are willing to deny drugs to their patients if they are priced higher than they are now, we will find that America is shouldering not just half or 2/3 or whatever of the profits of the drug industry. It's going to be shouldering all of it, right? And it'll just mean that Americans are going to pay even more for the innovation that they want. So if, however, we discover that the Europeans have more heart than they've been letting on, and that they're not really willing to let their patients suffer, then we might in fact discover that the Europeans will pay more of their fair share, and it could potentially reduce the US prices that companies project, that they'll have to count on in order to justify innovation. I don't know what's going to happen, and that's the dangerous thing about IPI, right? You could go through years of turmoil discovering which way it's going to go. There certainly are signs that even in the UK, which has a reputation for being pretty draconian, that when they're really forced to think about whether they're willing to pay for a drug, that they will. There's an oncology drug, Sutent, that Pfizer sold that was quite expensive, that NICE deemed to be not cost effective, and seemed to refuse to pay for. But the UK came up with a special cancer fund, and seemed to be willing to pay for Sutent out of that cancer fund. And somehow the UK reassured itself that, well, we didn't really deviate from our cost effectiveness metrics because we didn't really use our standard proper budget. No, we have this special other fund. And look, in truth, I don't think any of us care which pocket the UK reached into. The bottom line is that the UK revealed itself to have a bit more heart than we thought they did, which is great, right? So I hope that if push comes to shove, we discover that Europe and Canada, that they are willing to pitch in and pay their fair share for these mortgages. Unfortunately, by the way, HR 3, one of the bills that the Senate, or the House, I should say, has been considering, it didn't just have IPI baked into it. It had IPI plus controls that would have prevented companies from raising that one standard unified price above where it's set now. So it would have actually forced, it basically would have now taken prices that previously were based on what, all these various countries were willing to pitch in, that little help that they were offering. It would have forced American prices down to those levels. It was just a complicated way of saying we want industry to offer a deep, deep cut. And no surprise, they modeled it as $1 trillion of savings over a decade, which is $100 billion per year. Mind you, the US pays $271 billion per year towards branded drugs. It's actually quite a modest part of our total economy, about 1.3%. But 271 billion, is if you shaved 100 billion off that, that's 38%, I believe. A 38%, discount off of what the U.S. pays for branded drugs today would absolutely decimate the industry. Like, there's no other way to make the math work. Yet somehow some economists managed to give the Congressional Budget Office the impression that, that would only result in, what was it, like 8 to 15 fewer drugs over the next decade. And I can tell you, if you're going to shave 38% off of this massive industry's budget when its profit margins are in the teens, there's no other outcome than that you will have dramatic reduction in the incentives to keep funding R&D.
So it comes to the next major point that you kind of introduced your book with is this idea that one of the big problems that you see is that insurance is just not doing what it should be doing. That the reason folks can't afford medications is because more recently out-of-pocket costs are high, and what is the point of doing that? Because now you're going to significantly influence whether or not patients take the drug because they have to pay out of their own pocket. And so, at some point you even bring up the fact, insurers, I think you use the term heartless, that these insurance plans are heartless. But and so, you're a big proponent of universal healthcare. You want health insurance that'll pay for everything, especially drugs. Would that be accurate?
No, wait. Just to be clear, universal coverage.
Universal coverage for.
It is impossible for any human being in America to afford any meaningful aspect of healthcare without the benefit of insurance, unless, of course, they're healthy, in which case that's nice, right? So healthcare in America is unaffordable. And that's because we actually have technology. We've got things we can do. Back when it was just like your doctor that would walk from town to town, and healthcare was whatever he happened to have in his medicine bag, maybe a few leeches. Okay, maybe some people could afford from the doctor, but today we've got hospitals and emergency rooms and ORs, and we've got all this technology and all these drugs and all these procedures. There's things we can do, and just to keep all those people employed, dividing that total number by the sliver of the American population that actually needs care in any given year comes to an astronomical number per person that's sick. But it's actually not an astronomical number if it's across the entire working population. Well, maybe I should say that healthcare services are growing to be an uncomfortably large number, but drugs, no. 271 billion divided by the 17 trillion of income that Americans have, it is entirely possible to make that amount of money going to branded drugs affordable for whoever needs them, right? So everybody needs insurance, and I believe that all patients should be able to afford, access whatever drug their doctors appropriately prescribe. So when I propose in the book that we dramatically lower or even eliminate out-of-pocket costs for drugs, I do believe that physicians are the learned intermediaries, as the law considers them to be, who know what is appropriate and what's not. Maybe they need a nudge from an electronic medical health record or something to remind them you can prescribe a generic statin first before you go to a PCSK9. But I don't believe that it's appropriate to deputize patients with high out-of-pocket costs and leverage their fear and anxiety.
So Peter,
second-guessing doctors.
So Peter, let's look at the experience of the PCSK9 inhibitors. I'm sorry, I hope you have a little bit of extra time, Peter. Usually we're done in about an hour, but this is.
No, I'm happy to go. Has it only been an hour?
It's only been an hour. But let's go through the experience. So this is where we'll have a little bit of a discussion where no, I mean clearly, look, I think the pharmaceutical industry is amazing. They have, in terms of what they've produced, remarkable. Cures for they've made HIV livable just in my lifetime. From me being a young doctor watching a young trainee watching just the ravages of HIV and AIDS and these
a lot of progress
in mostly poor, disadvantaged communities, by the way. All right, and look what's happened. Immunosuppressive drugs have made transplant work. I could go on and on. So I think the value of the pharmaceutical company, the value of the American pharmaceutical company in terms of what it does for the globe, there's a little doubt that there's a massive value add there. But as in all things, there's gaming, and there's an issue with what value are you really? Can one do better? Is there a more efficient system that one can move towards? And there are certainly many examples. You talk about Daraprim, a drug that is available for not much money at all elsewhere, but because of regulatory barriers, because of
that's an old drug. We paid off the mortgage on it.
Sorry?
It's an old drug, and we paid off the mortgage on it. That's exactly one of those drugs that should be available at high quality for the rest of all time.
Right. And so you speak strongly for the fact that we should take away the regulatory stuff that allows companies like Turing and what's his name to Shkreli to kind of jack up prices and
the loopholes. Loopholes
that's of course the stuff that's on that's the easy low-lying fruit and stuff, right? But one of the issues is this idea of what is efficacious, what's beneficial. So take PCSK9 inhibitors that you brought up is a great example. Statins have been a fairly remarkable class of drugs, which are used incredibly widely by cardiologists to lower. Somebody comes in on the LDL who's had a prior event in the 180s, and we take their LDL down to the 70s, and we think, over a 10-year time span, relative risk reduction over that time, that we're doing something good, something really good in terms of reducing the risk of having.
That sounds like a patient for whom the statins actually worked. So
Right,
that's great.
exactly. But here's here's the thing. You have the PCSK9 inhibitors that came on the market, and the problem for the PCSK9 inhibitors were that statins are so darn good, right? So you have so the studies were done. The studies
Yeah,
were done on patients who had an average LDL of 90,
yeah,
and they drove those LDLs remarkably from 90 to 50. But the benefit from going to 90 to 50 is much different than the benefit from going from 180 to 90. So there's, as would be
yeah.
expected, there's some law of diminishing returns in terms of what one gets by doing this.
And
So
yet they did work. They showed improvements in cardiovascular outcomes.
they did, but the amount was less.
I'm
I don't
with
think
you. I'm with
so.
you.
But
And
the
they
issue,
too will go generic, right? And
they
they
will go generic. They will go generic.
for
But
the
the
rest of
issue,
all time.
right.
Yeah.
But the issue, of course, is in this period of time. Initially, the drugs are priced at some $12,000 a year, and the payers balked at paying. They said, unless and the way they kind of nudged us as doctors, because as you're saying, the learned intermediaries that we are, right? Patient comes to
Yeah.
LDL 90. Hey, if we can get their LDL, I mean, I would tell the patients, I was like, look, yes, you can have an additional risk lowering by getting to 50. You're already on a max statin, so we could
Sure.
give you a PCSK9 if you want. And guess what? Some of the patients said, sure, I don't mind getting injected if I can reduce my risk even more. And I would write it. This is early on. I would write it. And, boom, I would get a denial and saying, no,
Yeah.
you have to prior auth it and do X, Y, and Z.
I get it.
And so, I was faced with the decision again, with the practice, we have lots of resources that we're using towards doing all sorts of things. And the question is, do I invest an hour of some person's time to try to fight this thing and send them the
No, I totally
juice
get
by the
why you
mile?
wouldn't. I mean, it's the
So,
insurance company's way of functionally saying no,
right.
right?
So,
It's the
I
beginning
would,
of a
right.
real problem in America. If I had to
Well,
worry that they'll do that to an Alzheimer's treatment, that they'd be like, oh, I'm not technically saying no. I'm simply putting up
right.
16 pages of forms for a doctor to fill out for every patient who objectively meets the criteria for this drug. And then later, by the way, when I do finally reluctantly grant prior authorization as
Yeah.
an insurance company, I'm still going to impose an out-of-pocket cost that is meant to nudge that patient to do what? Not
Right.
take a drug that I have agreed is appropriate for him. Yeah, the system is discouraging
But
use of drugs that we've successfully developed, which in 20, 30 years, when not just these antibodies that annoyingly have to be injected once every 2 weeks or a couple of injections once a month, right? But actually RNAi,
yeah.
right, is what's coming.
Yep.
When you
Yep.
can give a subcutaneous injection once every 6
Yep.
months, and that is a chemical that is much more readily genericized. And so when in 20 years, that drug is as cheap as it can be, you've got generic, RNAi, PCSK9 inhibitors.
But
Won't you inject the person with
yeah.
the LDLs of 90 or 110
Yeah.
or whatever, knock them down knowing the benefits?
Absolutely, but that doesn't mean that we can't debate what we should pay for the drug now. So what happened with the PCSK9 story, for instance,
Yeah,
was I would go to the patient and say, "Hey, look, I'm sorry, we can't get this drug prior approved without a significant effort." And
yeah,
in your particular case, the conversation we would have was, "Look, you're already at 90. The benefit, it's not, I don't know, I don't, if you want, you can pay for the drug on your own, which nobody said okay to."
yeah.
But so the only folks that we really went through that process for was the folks that were having recurrent events with their LDL at 90, or if their LDL was 180 on a max dose statin and on Zetia, and they still
Yep.
whatever, and then we would say, all right, it is worth it for you. So we
Yeah.
kind of had this conversation. You kind of came to it, and guess what happened in a matter of 2 years? What's happened to the prices of PCSK9? And by the way, the PCSK9 story is interesting because there were two branded drugs that were
Yeah,
available
that's right.
that could play off one another. So
That's right. By the way, it's not
so
like they didn't know that they would have to come down on price. I
right,
mean,
but did
every
that
company
happen?
when it launches a drug knows that insurance companies are going to put up barriers, not to
Right,
mention the insurance companies want to extract
right,
their own rebates, their
right,
kickbacks. And
right.
so the launch price of any drug has to be higher to allow for that nonsense,
That
right?
negotiation take
Or
place. Yeah.
competition,
Right,
something to make the insurance
right,
companies feel like they did their jobs.
right,
Mind you, insurance in America doesn't actually want the cost of healthcare to go down. They get their 15%
right,
off
right,
the
right, right.
total
No,
pie.
yeah,
They want the whole thing to grow. They would like nothing more than for healthcare to be 50% of the economy in the next 30 years if they can. They just don't like any one cost creeping up on them next year during their budget. So
yeah, I understand what you're saying.
All right.
But the insurance,
okay,
but the payers, right? My point is that in this time when we're trying to figure out how much of an investment we need to be making for that long-term thing, in that time, without the insurance, without the payers setting up these barriers, we would never have gotten. I mean, that was their way of negotiating. And I'm asking you.
First of all, I'm not opposed. I'm not opposed to them playing two companies off.
No, not just two companies, but you would be opposed to them balking to say, hey, look, the FDA approved it. If a doctor writes it, you should cover it.
Absolutely,
right?
I am absolutely opposed to insurance companies stepping in and saying, oh, we acknowledge that this patient, would experience a benefit from this drug, that they've proven that there's a reduction in their risk of death and stroke and heart attack, whatever, from this. We just don't think their life is worth it. I'm opposed to that because the moment America says, that's cool, that's okay, we need someone looking out for our budgets, it's really essential that we spend $800 billion on healthcare administration and paperwork. It's absolutely essential that we spend a ton of money on corn subsidies. All those costs are important. By the way, Fortnite is a really worthwhile expense for our children. All those expenses are important. So you know what? Let's cut back on what we spend on drugs that will inexpensively save people's lives for the rest of all time. Right. Yeah, I have a problem with America doing that because it's the end of biomedical innovation if we accept it.
But Peter, but every new drug isn't the same. So it's not like transplant where if I don't transplant this person, they will die, right? In the case of statins, in the case of PCSK9s with an LDL of 90. You have to treat X number of people and for X amount of time for one person to not have it. So that conversation about value and how much it's worth to you, which isn't that a worthwhile one to be had between a doctor and a patient, as opposed to an insurance company saying,
I don't think that it's a conversation that a patient can have. See, a patient just had a heart attack, and the patient has not taken classes on health economics or any of that. And so the question is, frankly, whether a doctor can even have that conversation, because last I heard that economics wasn't taught in medical school either.
Right.
The bottom line is that doctors, they take a Hippocratic oath, right? Which I don't believe has a very big financial component to it, as much as people are starting to introduce the idea of financial toxicity.
Yeah.
I think that neither doctor nor patient are equipped to have the economic discussion. What they can have is a conversation about the medical appropriateness of a given therapy that the FDA has blessed and said it is safe and effective for the following patients with this label. And so a doctor is there to figure out, is this drug going to help this patient? We as a society have to figure out what tools do we want to give doctors to use, knowing that doctors are not going to be in the best position to apply financial analysis to see what's worth it. So I think that, for example, a different approach that insurance companies could take for medical appropriateness is to say, we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt, Dr. Cardiologist, that you will prescribe drugs to the best of your knowledge appropriately, but we will review the data. We will compare your prescribing habits to those of everybody else. And if we see that you are deviating notably from the prescribing habits of a typical cardiologist, we will have a conversation with you. Our medical director, who is medically trained, will have a conversation with you, Dr. Cardiologist, who is medically trained, and we will talk about whether you happen to be getting a lot more serious patients, and that's why you're prescribing more PCSK9s, or are you in the pocket of the drug companies? Did you really enjoy that $15 pizza so much that you got to have more and you're going to prescribe a ton more PCSK9s? Or do you just not understand standard of care, in which case, go take another course and we'd like to see your prescribing habits more in line. It is possible to police this stuff after the fact. You do not have to be so paranoid about preventing every case of overutilization that you cause the problem that we have today, which is undertreatment. There are people that are dying and suffering from their diseases that do not need to be because the treatments are right there. And we shouldn't pretend that those treatments are expensive, because in fact they're not. Each incremental dose of the PCSK9 is cheap. And if you want the PCSK9, but you just don't want it used for, 5 million people, you only want it used for 500,000 people, then again, to the extent that we, the industry, learn how much you will arbitrarily narrow the patient population down, then the math that innovators are using to figure out whether to pursue something is to divide a large enough number by the number of patients and price accordingly. So it's just hard to adjust the price after the fact, but it sounds to me like maybe the way that these PCSK9s are used, saved only for the patients that are so badly off that you're willing to fill out 16 pages of prior auth, is maybe they should have been priced a lot higher for that small population of desperate patients. And then the companies would have made the kind of revenue that they were projecting for a drug that was as big a breakthrough as that was. They simply assumed that America had more heart, that insurance companies would at least authorize the use of these drugs on label, right? Now, what I've heard actually from talking to some payers is that they actually find that patients do get prescribed these drugs, PCSK9s, they just drop off at a really fast pace because they have to be injected every 2 weeks. No one feels their LDL. And, at the end of the day, they're like, whatever, I'm sure I'm fine. And so there's a very poor adherence. Maybe they don't like their copays. Copayments certainly contribute to poor adherence. And so it may just be that the poor sales of PCSK9s are not nearly as much due to the barriers that these heartless payers have put up. It may be that America's actually had more heart than we give it credit for when it came to PCSK9s. It's just that the first generation of these PCSK9 inhibitors were not convenient enough, to match the kind of chronic, silent nature of cardiovascular risk.
Interesting, Peter, because I've heard the exact argument made the other way around for the statins, meaning people are non-compliant with their statins because it is so difficult to take a medication every day, as opposed to the PCSK9, where it's just twice a month and then that's it. I mean, in fact, there's a prominent Ethan Weiss, a cardiologist, who just made that exact point on Twitter the other day. He said, finally, the great thing about PCSK9s is that the patients are much more compliant and much more easy to stick with it.
You know what? I think that he might be right, but not about these PCSK9s. I think that what we're going to get soon from the RNAi product is once every 6 months subcutaneous injection. And I do take a statin every day myself. And I actually wonder if I had a choice between a statin and that I take every day and a sub-Q injection that I get once every 6 months, which one I would take. I think I'd probably take the injection once every 6 months, so I didn't have to remember, I didn't have to travel with it. I miss a few doses here and there, which isn't the worst thing in the world. But the reality is that the PCSK9 that I would be getting once every 6 months, I completely understand why, while it's branded, payers are going to be absolutely draconian about making sure that I am taking my statin first and foremost. It's generic, and only if I have true residual cardiovascular risk and on label for the PCSK9, they would allow me to take the once every 6 months sub-Q injection. If they don't, if they say, no, your life's not worth it, I still want to put up roadblocks, I don't care if you get a higher rate of death, and patients are clamoring for that injection once every 6 months, and doctors are saying it's really easy to give, they're right there in my office, then I will be worried, because it means that the industry will have delivered a really great drug, a really convenient technology, one that basically it takes a form factor that makes adherence really easy. And American insurance companies still will be doing everything in their power to dissuade that kind of innovation. I think that would be a turning point for innovation in America. And I think it's going to make a lot of people rethink, so what will America pay when we have a breakthrough like an Alzheimer's drug?
But Peter, there are multiple different, again, if it's this issue of value, and clearly the way you value PCSK9s may be very different than the way many different segments of the population value things. This is the whole thing with talking about societal value, right?
Yeah,
Society clearly values big, broad things, right? Society values, we were talking earlier, nobody living in.
Well, actually, let me
okay.
maybe take over here.
Yeah.
Because that's on that point, so the point that you're making, what society values. Peter, can I go back to the sort of the premise? I thought it was very interesting, the premise of your book and what you talked about, this idea of a social contract between the pharmaceutical industry and the people.
Yes.
You know, it's interesting because the idea of the social contract, if you believe in it or not, I mean, it's between the state and the people, right? I mean, that's the original idea. I tend to think of it more as a metaphor and maybe even a myth. You know, it's how we like to think about how we engage in our political life, because there's no actual contract that people sign. And then when you have a contract, there should be a third party overseeing, you know, making sure that the terms of the contract are enforced. Whereas when it's between the people and the government, there's no real third party. It's always the government that's the third party. But at any rate, in this case, you're proposing a social contract between a private, I mean, an industry, right? A private sector or part of the people and the people. Is that right? Or, I mean, is there
let's not take it too far. You know,
okay,
the industry is people too. So it's really a contract among people, right? We have 330 million people in the US,
right?
And it just so happens that ballpark about 5 million of them have these skills, whether it be scientists or accountants or what have you, or manufacturing people, to work on these particular problems of diseases and how we can solve them with medicines. Okay. And we've got 1 million who are physicians, and we've got a bunch of people who are really good at acting, and you know, they give us all the content we get on Netflix, and all money is just labor. And so out of 330 million people, do I like the fact that 5 million of us are not focused on how we grow more food or how we make clothing or how we build shelter? You know, the jobs of these 5 million people, this small sliver of the population, is how can we, you know, come up with ways to make sure that our children don't scratch themselves bloody from eczema when they're 1 or 2 years old, or, you know, die of anaphylaxis, you know, from a nut in their food or something. I mean, I like the idea that there are 5 million, you know, people in our country that are working on those problems. I don't think we need to repurpose those people to create Fortnite 7 or build another nuclear bomb or, you know, build another McDonald's or whatever. I think we're good on all those fronts. Other people can handle that.
Right, but why? I mean, that's a proposal. I mean, it's your opinion, and you're obviously among the 5 million.
It's a court of public opinion.
Right, yeah. Correct. But I mean, why? I mean, people, the Green New Deal, right? People are making sort of similar arguments. They're saying, look, the planet depends on low energy, you know, green energy producers. We should really invest a lot more into green energy, because otherwise, I mean, it's really something that's
right.
The public is incapable of taking action, and so we have to subsidize the Green New Deal energies and sector and so forth.
It's true. As a society, we have to act. Right?
Which means that we have to take money from one sector to the next against their will.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, okay.
We should.
So you want subsidies for the pharmaceutical industries because.
Well, I don't know why. Just to be clear, though, why do you call it subsidies? I mean, unless you mean all payments are a form of subsidy, I suppose. But it's
correct.
Just payment.
Right.
I want incentive and funding for 5 million people to be clothed and fed and
you want
work on this.
You want tax dollars to be used to, right? I mean, you want taxes to be used,
or call insurance premiums, whatever you want to call it.
Correct.
It's all society's money. So whether we want to make arbitrary distinctions of insurance premiums or taxes, it really doesn't matter, right? So yes, I want 5 million out of 330 million Americans working on drugs. In fact, maybe I'd like 6 or 7. And I think maybe we could take some people that today are really busy filling out all kinds of paperwork that they, you know, use to harass patients to pay bills, because we've got an incredibly shattered system. maybe I would like a streamlined system with less bureaucracy so we can repurpose a couple million of those folks to helping out elsewhere where they might be more productive. Health coaches to help people, live healthier lifestyles. I think you guys covered that in one of your podcasts, right?
But how would you answer the person that would say, listen, this sounds a little self-serving? Because I mean, you're part of this industry already, and you started the podcast talking about the gripes that people have against the pharmaceutical industry. Okay.
It's absolutely self-serving. I
Right.
am a father with 2 children, and I have parents, and I have all these people that I love, and I so badly want, America to keep doing what it's really good at. I am cursed with the fact that I actually know we can make a difference on all these fronts. And if I were ignorant of that, if I thought, well, I mean, surely there's nothing we can do about, Duchenne muscular dystrophy or sickle cell disease, fine, then I could take that attitude and say that let's work on something we can fix, like climate change. But I know that we can make a difference in the lives of these children and all these people. And so for us to sit around with the tools to be able to fix these problems, and we just need funding for this industry, like everyone's got to eat. So for us to have the tools to do it, as long as society will pay the bills, and to be told by society, we don't want you to because other things are more important, I'm willing to have that discussion. It is essential that we all figure out what's most important. But 1.3% of our GDP going towards developing new treatments for diseases that plague us, cannot possibly be the pool of money that we, take to pay for other important things.
But Peter,
there is waste in our society. Let's go for the waste first. And there's plenty of it in, the healthcare sector. There's plenty. And after we have used up all the waste, and now it's just a choice that we have to make among a bunch of really good causes, then let's have the conversation that you want to have and talk about, is it climate change or is it medicine? Because they're both essential if we want our kids and grandkids to be healthy. And maybe we do need to pare back on biotechnology for biomedical innovation and apply biotechnology to climate change for a while till we've solved climate change. I'm open to that.
A quick aside before we come back to this idea of value and societal value and how one comes up with that is that when you talk about you look back at the history and of things that have been decided by society as saying, all right, we must pay for this because this is a societal good. Okay, we need to somehow. You don't like the word subsidy, but we must somehow figure out how to make it happen. All right. So I mean, that's why the word subsidy seems to fit. And you look at housing, right?
Well, if you consider what you pay McDonald's, to be a subsidy, then fine. You can call anything a subsidy. But society,
meaning when we say, yeah, well, okay, I mean, no, because there is a subsidy there because, there's obviously a corn subsidy. There's massive agricultural subsidies that allow that hamburger to cost $5 and is within the reach of whatever. But if you look at some things that we've decided we must subsidize, all right, or we must have. And if you look at health, if you look at healthcare, you look at the higher education system. Right, since 1997, the prices have changed something like it's 200% more expensive. In those items that we have said that they're so important that we must provide access to those to everything. You've seen what's happened to college tuitions, correct? By the same token, what has happened to software? What has happened to personal computers? What has happened to TVs? These things in real dollars, not by
inflation adjusted
dollars, inflation adjusted dollars have come down in price, right? So
really,
there are dangerous.
This has come down in price. This has not come down in price. This has actually gone up in price, but it's also gone up in quality, and people choose to buy this. It is so great that people, sink an inordinate amount of their discretionary income into this because it doesn't feel discretionary anymore. We all got to be linked up. And Apple is one of the most profitable companies in the world, despite the fact that, apparently Moore's Law has been, dropping the price of computing power dramatically. This thing should cost 25 cents. So how come we're paying a fortune for it? So I
Well,
disagree. I don't think that things work quite as you
well,
guys are
smartphones do. I mean, there's obviously many alternatives to the iPhone X.
Yeah, do you see any of those in
which is,
circulation?
what's that?
I don't see too many of those alternatives in circulation.
Well, I mean,
You know,
there's,
I don't
I
see
mean,
many
again,
buggy whips in
that has to do with
circulation
rich America. That maybe the crowd you hang out with mostly has. So the crowd. I mean, it may be that you know, college kids may have, you know, they have cheaper phones. The point is, if you want to buy, yes, the cost of a Ferrari, right? I mean, you're holding up, you know, the iPhone, which is the best smartphone. The price of Ferraris, yes, has gone up over time, but the price of cars, or the price of clothing, or the price of TVs is a great example, right? Like there's a 60-inch. It may not be the greatest 4K OLED TV, but those prices have in general come down. Whereas stuff that we have said we must have, it is not just a choice, but a right to have. The prices of those have massively expanded, and some
have they though? I'm not following the logic. We just talked about how drugs go generic, and they fall dramatically in price.
Oh yeah.
So you know, when the HIV drugs all thoroughly go generic, you will find that, you know, they cost next to nothing, and yet they are just as effective. So why are we talking about drugs as if suddenly they don't adhere?
I guess I should be healthcare. The amount that the average American since the 1970s pays.
You mean what doctors charge? You mean doctors' salaries?
But Peter, we started the conversation about the point that drug prices are too high. I mean, that's the whole thing. The impetus for your book was the outrage about. So we're not talking about generics after they go off patents, but we're talking about.
But no, we are talking. But that's the whole point of the book. We have to be talking about generics and brands at the same time. You can't just focus on the new stuff.
Right, but the premiums that Americans are paying, Peter, right? The premiums that Americans are paying now for healthcare versus what they were paying in the 1970s has gone up a significant amount. Now, I'm with you. Generics are
almost
awesome.
Entirely because of healthcare services.
No, I'm with you. And you know, we have this debate all the time with people that attack us. We say, "Oh, physicians were only 7%."
I'm not attacking you. I'm just stating the facts. 90% of the expenses are for everything other than branded drugs. Therefore, 90% of all the increases in branded drugs are not a higher fraction of healthcare than they were.
No, they're not a higher fraction, but how much we're paying. I mean, how much we're paying for those branded drugs has gone up since the 1970s.
Yes,
right?
It has, because we've invented more. Have we invented more doctors, or are doctors just getting paid more than they were?
Right. So
we have invented more drugs, and then they become, you know, cheap commodities, and we have to invent new ones. If America is still spending $271 billion 15 years from now on branded drugs, it's because every drug you know of and vilify and hate and think is too expensive today, I'm not saying you, but the public, has gone generic. No one's talking about it anymore. It's, you know, easily affordable. It's taken for granted. And we must have invented an entirely new set of drugs that America is paying $271 billion for. It takes a lot of hustle for all these people, 5 million people, all these scientists, to invent an entirely new set of drugs. Tell me something. Will the healthcare services industry have completely reinvented itself, and every hospital and every doctor will actually be a cheap commodity, and you will all invented like entirely new robotic systems and things like that are add to our standard of care? Or will you still be running the same hospitals, the same ORs? You'll still be you, just grayer, and you'll be charging even more because naturally salaries go up.
Well, how would we know? I mean,
well, we know because we can look at the last 15 years and the last 30
but
years.
that's sort of a you know, it's a post hoc fallacy. I mean, you can't you know, you have to do a thought experiment. You can't just historically. I mean, our industry, healthcare, has been subsidized massively. There's no argument about that. Doctors have benefited in their salaries. Hospitals have benefited in their bottom lines. The pharmaceutical industry has benefited in its profitability in general. So I don't think there's any argument about that.
15% profit margins, sure.
Okay, but the question is that at the same time, Anish is pointing out to, is consumer goods in industries that are less subsidized seem to increase in quality and decrease in price and they decrease in price massively. I mean, the phone, if you look at the equivalent technological capability of a phone and the number of hours that an average worker salary would have to work to buy a phone 30 years ago or 20 years ago versus the number of hours that one has to spend to get an iPhone today, it's massively less, right? So the consumer goods are much more
entirely
affordable.
sure that math holds up. You can buy a landline phone super cheap today, right? Probably find some phone for $15, and it is like the best landline phone that has ever existed. Except the standard has gone up, and you basically can't function in today's economy. Your company hires you; they expect you to be available, wherever you may be. You can't just limit yourself to a landline in many cases. So actually, I believe that the world drags you along and forces you to upgrade your technologies. You can't buy a cheap horse and a buggy whip these days anymore. You have to get a car. So I don't think it's quite that straightforward. But yes, on the whole, I agree with you that manufactured goods become commodities, and the standard of care goes up and quality of life goes up, and drugs adhere to that, and healthcare services do not. Land and labor just go up over time. Only manufactured goods give us the kinds of economies that you're talking about. So I'm not going to apologize for the fact that as long as all drugs go generic, not all do, and we do need new regulation in order to make sure that they do. But if all drugs were to go generic, then they would remain qualitatively, just because of this function of being able to drop off a cliff, they would be the most cost-effective aspect of all of healthcare. And let's just run an experiment. Let's just nationalize all drugs. Starting tomorrow, basically the system says, we're just not paying anything slightly more than the cost of production. Immediately, companies will say, well, what can we do? Nothing. So I guess let's just sell what we have already for whatever price will generate incremental, a little bit of profit, fine. Shut down all R&D because you can't justify the return on it. And instantly, our spending on healthcare will drop by like 7 or 8%, right? Because all branded drugs will have instantly been genericized. So we will end up saving something like 0.7 or let's just say 0.8 or 0.9% of our GDP. Great. 5 million people put out of work, 5 million people who are trained, skilled in some ways to solve diseases and help bring about drugs. They will be repurposed to what end?
But no one is arguing, right? No one here is arguing to nationalize the
No, but let's just run the experiment. Right. Let's just run the experiment. Okay. So you've just saved a bunch of money. Meanwhile, what will happen to healthcare costs over time? They will keep going up, right? In fact, they will go up even faster because the hip replacement surgeries that we could have averted with a new drug that helps strengthen our bones so that we don't break them and we don't need the surgery, that will never be invented. And so now we will see that 4% increase in the cost of hip replacement surgery, the spending on hip replacement surgery for the rest of all time, until, of course, we put all hip surgeons on salary and control their price.
But the problem is that hip replacements, the problem is that the price mechanism in healthcare seems to be broken, but precisely because it is backed up by the ability of the federal government to go into massive amounts of debt to pay for it, right? So a price, at one place, a hip replacement at the Surgical Center of Oklahoma, at Keith Smith is a anesthesiologist that runs a cash only, basically a cash only business where he goes, all right, if you want a hip replacement, it's this much, and it's like, I don't know how much, it's like 1/10 the price of what the hospital down the street charges. Now, again, the hospital has obviously a little bit more overhead, has a 24-hour ER, has more staff, etc. But it seems hard to understand why it is, you have costs that are 10 times as much. Hospital margins are also tiny, sliver. Every hospital you go to, they say we're barely eking by, right? And
I'm not accusing hospitals of being profiteers.
No, I am. I'm accusing them because
okay, fair enough. But they're
well, I think that because their costs are whatever it is they say they are. So the marginal costs are driven by the expenses that are coming in. And so
where's the money go, by the way? Help me understand this. If indeed they can charge anything they want, then where does the money go? Because it's not like nurses are making a killing.
Nurses do well. Doctors do very well. Administrators do well.
They make 5 times more than they need to make, nurses?
Well, I don't know. That sort of gets to this question of what should people make, and that's a hard thing. You know, I'll just say the NHS, which is tightly centrally controlled, everything is salaried, right? Nurses there start at £20,000 a year. The nurses here will start at 60, and in a matter of 4 or 5 years, will be making.
They have
80,
debt from
to
universities. Like, are we going to talk about how much universities, how much regulations that dictate who can do what procedure,
licenses,
and how much
and all that stuff.
education,
Yeah.
right? How much debt that imposes, and that all that has to be paid off. I mean, my understanding is doctors are practically indentured servants, for like 15 years after they graduate, because they've got so much debt.
Right.
So in the end, what we call high prices for surgery are really just paying off.
But Peter, I mean, the point here is that all these arguments cannot be solved by sitting down and having a social contract and saying, agreeing together socially what your drug is worth, what your industry is worth, what Anisha's hospital is worth, what the nurse is worth, taking into account the debt and the this and the that. They can't. And normally, there's a market's price mechanism that takes place that allows allocation, to spontaneously go to where the services that are valued the most, away from the services that are valued the least.
Michelle, we just talked about education, nurses, hospitals, surgeons, drugs, accounting firms, legal firms, drug manufacturers, all these patients. We've just talked about what I think might add up collectively to like 30% of the American economy. At some point, when you say like, oh, well, the market has to function, but no, I'm not going to describe this 30% of the American economy as the market, I think maybe we need to agree on what a market is. I think this is maybe a complicated market, but I definitely think it's a market. And I think that as long as drugs, ultimately succumb to the law of the jungle, the ultimate libertarian, bastion of fairness, when all regulations go away and, lots of
subsidies go away.
Subsidies go away. That's it. Like it's just you and a rock and the woods, and you're back to the wilderness. Only drug prices drop in that whole thing. Universities.
But why only drug? I'm not saying that only. I'm not saying that only the drug industry should be deregulated and the subsidies should be pulled.
What I'm saying is the drug industry is the least regulated of everything you just named. And my job here with you guys, with this book, is actually pretty narrow, because you're right. I cannot encapsulate this whole thing in my head. I cannot make a case for the entire American economy. But I am here to remind the American public and Congress and everybody entering the biotech industry and every doctor and everybody that actually the drug industry is the least of the regulated. It's the one that is already subject to the most natural price control, as you alluded to. Its products go off a cliff and become cheap over time, like phones and cars and everything else. Like, we are abiding by the rules of a free market system far more, even if not perfectly, to some of your points, far more than anything else that you've named so far.
I'm willing to accept that. I'm willing to accept that. But my point is that you should try to move more in that direction. I think to the extent that you abide by the rules of the free market, that's very laudable. And I agree that the pharmaceutical industry provides a lot of value, and that even without the subsidies, patients would, people would pay a fair price, but the demand would be what it is. And I think instead,
no insurance.
No insurance.
No insurance. I'll tell you what you'll get. You'll get Botox. You'll have Botox and wrinkle fillers.
Well, listen. At the end of the day, if that's what people want, that's what people want.
But that's not going to be what people want. That's not going to be what people want.
But people also like to underinvest in infrastructure, and in 50 years our pipes are going to break. And people underinvest in themselves. They don't invest in the military. They can also be raging racists and commit all kinds of crimes. So why don't we just not pay any taxes? Since taxes are a form of subsidies for civilization. I mean, what are you really talking about?
No. But wait. We're off the rails. No. Simple stuff. Let's get back.
Shouldn't have insurance and things would be better. All you got to do is look at a family with a sick child, and you'll realize, like, that is not the America we live in.
No, well,
You know?
but there would be, insurance is a natural construct. Society would come up with some insurance scheme because nobody wants to live. And life insurance came up with, so anyway, but that's a separate issue. Let's not go there. But the quick thing. But look, progress has happened. There's massive progress that's happened. That's made all our lives incredibly better. That's happened without some insurance scheme to pay for innovation, though, Peter. You have to agree to that, right? So
yes,
Henry Ford,
to make innovation affordable.
No. But there have been in history is replete with technological progress that has made our lives better, that has not required an insurance scheme to pay for that. Henry Ford did not have someone saying, oh, we must have whatever cars, and therefore we will pay X amount for each car so that you can produce it.
So just to be clear, what you're saying is...
No, I'm simply saying that their progress has happened outside of healthcare, and there's been massive, I mean, Andrew Moore,
so just because
Silicon Valley chips, personal computers, all that happened without somebody saying this is the way we must go. Because what you're talking about, Peter, is a planned economy. And look, there's obviously lots of evidence of planned economy.
It's not at all a planned economy. I disagree entirely. It is not a planned economy. Planned economy is what the Arnold Foundation and others who say there's a formula for everything and we know what it is. That's a planned economy. I'm saying,
you're right. Yeah.
I don't know what the value of this is, but I do know that if society is just willing to support the drug industry to the tune of something in the ballpark of what it has been, 1.3% of GDP, I personally would prefer it be more, right? Because I think that it would be better to invent new medicines than to invent Fortnite 7 and to have another Netflix or whatever. But I also respect the fact that maybe people would rather suffer from heart disease while watching the second coming of Game of Thrones, and if that's what they choose, fine, I get it. But I am absolutely going to lobby for what I believe is worth it. It's my job in a democracy. It is like the antithesis of a planned economy, that I'm out there defending what I believe is a better use of society's funds. Nor am I suggesting that we not have another coming of Game of Thrones. That was a really great show. And I think that if society would just see that inventing a drug that cuts the need for heart transplants or for expensive rehabilitation, after hip replacement surgeries or whatever, we would in fact have both more money and more time and peace of mind to enjoy the next season of Game of Thrones.
But Peter, nobody lobbied for Game of Thrones to come up. Nobody lobbied for Ford to start making his machines. So I would say
that's not true. That's not true because
come on.
No, I'm sorry.
No, meaning nobody said we want. Meaning, I would say you should trust the American people, the American populace.
That is not true.
To value what it is you make.
Cable is not free. And there was a ton of lobbying to make sure that Americans would get cheap cable, and that cable companies should not be able to charge HBO a certain excess in order to pipe its content.
All the innovation came from the cable cutters. HBO is what brought Game of Thrones, not stupid ABC, CBS, or Fox. Right? Netflix, that's why there's tons of innovation. So it's cutting the cable and going through the internet that allowed for that stuff to happen.
The internet requires a cable. I don't know where you
live. Cable by cable cutting. Yes. I thought you were talking about TV cable and stuff. And
I'm talking about cable that pipes internet in, and the fact that the companies that control that cable also would like to be able to control, throttle back the speed at which you get content that they control and they don't. There are people lobbying for the proper application of rules to this game that we play in, right? It's all game theory. That's what regulators do. And we're making little adjustments here and there to make sure that we have a free market. A free market is not chaos. It's not anarchy. You know that, right? A free market is a effectively regulated market. And when natural monopolies set in, they need to be regulated. Where there aren't natural monopolies, and I would posit that there are many drug classes that are not natural monopolies, plenty of competition, and the fact that they go generic. So even if they are a natural monopoly for a temporary period of time, it's self-correcting by the fact that the patents expire and they go generic. That sure always happens.
Right.
There is a trend in the industry to go to natural monopolies that can't go generic. That needs to be nipped.
But I think find agreement. We're all in agreement that the pharmaceutical company produces an amazing amount of value. Maybe greater than any other segment of the population because of any other segment of healthcare.
I love that. I would love to stop you right there.
Because of exactly what you're talking about. And because of that, I would say that it is so obvious to 330 million Americans that you would find a robust market to support you, even without the need
I think you're right. I think you're right. Here's how I think it's going to go.
Yeah.
Here's how it's going to go, right? Let's play this one out. We're now in the third hour. This is the fun hour. For those of you that have been listening with us for the last nearly 2 hours, this is the payoff. This is the fun hour, right? I think it's going to go like this. Let's just say Congress imposes price controls and, the industry basically disintegrates, right?
We would oppose that.
Well, no.
I would oppose it.
Okay. It wipes out insurance. People have to pay out of pocket. And the industry basically says, well, I can't invent a cancer drug that is going to help 5,000 people with a particular, type of cancer driven by ALK or TREC or whatever.
Yeah, right. That I'm not sure we agree on that.
Look what happened in the NHS. Even the NHS, the controlled system, when there was a drug that was of such value to the entire populace, what happened? Something
just one second.
Created.
One second.
Okay.
I'm saying that, first we destroy what we have by eliminating insurance. And all of a sudden, the industry reacts immediately. Trust me, I will not have a fund to invest in, right? And I'm going to have to basically find something else to do with my time, with all my training, everything I've ever done. It's kind of pointless. And then all of a sudden people will say, wait, we're dying of cancer. And there's hopefully still NIH funded research. And they're saying, hey, I think I have an idea for how to treat this particular kind of cancer that's driven by an ABC mutation. And, maybe some academics will, with their limited budgets, sequence some patients and say, hey, some cancers are caused by mutations in ABC. I bet if this academic chemist over there were to develop a drug, for these patients, there's only 5,000 of them. And, it would take an inordinate amount of money, for those 5,000 patients to fund, this particular thing. But I could do it. And it's possible that when we accumulate a whole bunch of, those kinds of realizations over time, where people realize that there's breakthroughs that we could be making in sickle cell disease and Duchenne muscular dystrophy and various cancers and Alzheimer's and whatever it is, that we will have maybe some donations going to a few groups that, manage to accumulate a few millions of dollars and make a little more progress. And maybe what we're going to get at some point is a real enthusiasm that surges up, and maybe we'll get a president, the next Nixon, that declares a war on cancer and dumps, $10 billion into a cancer fund and says, that's it, we're going to put an end to cancer. And then somebody will say, really? We should trust a single centrally planning government organization to deploy $10 billion? That's the most efficient way to do it? Wouldn't it be better to instead use that as a kind of X prize to incentivize companies to try to develop some drugs for cancer? And in the end, what I believe would happen is you would end up, from first principles, reinventing a system that looks an awful lot like this one. Except it may take 30 years for us, after we've destroyed what we have today, this institution that we have today, it may take us 30 years to reinvent what we have today again.
No, but Peter, clearly, if we destroy what we have and we don't change our principles, we're going to get the same thing, right? So the point is not just to destroy, but it's to work on the basis of the correct principles for, a just society or a better society or whatever. Okay.
I would hope those principles are better. I would hope we would say that all 5,000 of those patients with that cancer should then get the drug, rather than simply say, well, we chose to fund the development of that drug for you, but we chose to only pay for 80% of it. And so
no, but in the scheme that you've outlined, first of all, the subsidy right now, let's say the government stops subsidizing insurance. Yeah. Presumably, if the subsidy comes from the taxpayers' money, then presumably it would go back into their pocket, and then they can choose to decide how to pay for it. Or if it comes from debt,
I don't assume that at all. You just threw a divide by zero in
no,
there.
because you said if the subsidy from the government goes away, then the industry will have its income completely go to zilch. Well, that's not true, because if the subsidy goes away, then it goes back, the same pile of money that is currently being by law channeled to the pharmaceutical industry would go into the private sector, and the private sector would decide. The private sector would decide whether they want to continue to spend it on the pharmaceuticals or whether they want to spend it to Fortnite or something else.
Yes, you're right.
Okay, so the money would be there, right?
But it would take a critical mass of suffering. I mean, we didn't used to have an insurance industry.
Why do you assume that? Why do you assume that innovation will, respond only to a critical mass of? I mean, people want to invest. Private citizens always and have always invested and sponsored industries to produce innovation.
Peter, you don't have enough
only for the masses.
You don't have enough faith. You don't have enough faith in your own industry's value, Peter. Your industry is so valuable that since the 1800s, But
I do. I'm telling you, it will come about again.
But we're saying let's make it come about without right.
Well, I'm not really
an artificial subsidy. There's an artificial subsidy that destroys the value. It, in the eyes of some people, it makes it overinflated, right? So people are critical of the pharmaceutical industry because they see it as being over-subsidized, and they say, "Oh, your profits are too much," and so you have to appeal to a certain calculus. You have to say, "Oh, but listen, it's only for the 10 years of the patent that we make profit. After that, it becomes a commodity and whatnot." And these are very complicated things. I mean, they are sort of central management, central planning things.
You have the data. You're physicians. I mean,
because you only have the data because it uses sort of artificial assessments of value. It's sort of an artificial.
Let me tell you, you have the data. They're right here. We don't have to invent counterfactuals. We absolutely have the data. Medically prescribed products, physician prescribed. We do. I'll tell you.
But there's no data.
Go ahead. What is the data?
I promise you. All you have to do is to take a look at some of the products that were developed by industry, knowing full well that they would not be able to count on insurance for any reimbursement whatsoever, and look at how well they have done, and who gets them and who doesn't get them. Do you know what they are?
No, but
well, we already talked about them. They're Botox, wrinkle fillers.
No, but again, this is not an experiment because it's in the setting. It's an environment where at the same time you have an insurance industry that continues and subsidized. So you have to remember
they are not covered by insurance.
No, I know, but that warps. But Peter,
they exist entirely outside of it.
Yes. But the presence of the subsidy, Peter, warps the whole investment pattern.
Correct.
So if there was,
these are outside of it. Any company could have developed Botox or wrinkle filler without any regard. It's as if you guys aren't linking the car industry to drugs and saying that drug subsidies warp the car industry. I'm saying Botox and wrinkle fillers are entirely their own area, except what they do is demonstrate that innovators, scientists, are capable of developing something with clinical trial costs, with clinical development risks, right? Knowing that they will only be able to recoup their investment and generate a return purely from people's choice. Their decision, I'm willing to pay that. They set a price based on what people could afford. It is a beautiful example of simply counting on raw free market willingness to pay to incentivize a complex FDA regulated drug development process. Are you with me now in seeing how wonderful a case study this is?
No, but how is that a counter to what I was saying?
It's not at all a counter. It is in fact giving you the answers. See, you have a window into what your world will look like, right? This is what I presume you want. You want to know, like, hey, if we just make these tweaks and eliminate these distortions and these subsidies, what will it look like? I will tell you what it will look like simply by looking at who gets Botox.
No, I mean, are you saying that in my world then only Botox would be developed and hepatitis C drugs would not be developed?
Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all.
So
to the extent that there are enough wealthy people who have hepatitis C and would have been willing to pay whatever it would have cost industry to develop it, you would have gotten that. However, just like Botox is not, sold to people who aren't willing to pay for it, others would not have gotten it.
This
right?
is the same.
So,
this is
if, however,
no,
you couldn't make the math work, if there weren't enough
wealthy people, no, that's not. But that ignores some things.
Those drugs.
No, again, history has to be our guide here because there are no great experiments. I understand your point is saying that, okay, you need enough wealthy people, and then you'll create policies that affect poor people, and more poor people, maybe black, etc., and that'll fundamentally racist. That's your point, correct? But
well, okay, I mean,
meaning you're saying
in there, but
no, meaning you're saying that the folks that will be benefited are only the wealthy, basically, correct?
Yeah, I didn't throw race or whatever in there, but
I mean,
extrapolate all you like.
Right.
But
well, that would result in inequities. I mean to say that's all I meant to say. But okay,
yeah,
right,
inequity. I mean, look, I don't mind that some people have smoother foreheads than others. I don't think that's a necessity. But my heart does break at the idea that anybody, frankly, in America or anywhere in the world, if their child has sickle cell disease or cystic fibrosis, that someone says, "No, you're too poor. You don't get it." I think that's heartbreaking.
But again, if you take a look at history in terms of how things developed, and say, again, higher education is a good example. There have always historically been there's been a demand for folks that are poor to be able to have access to higher education. Correct. Before, there were these massive subsidies to go to low interest loans from the government, etc. Right. There were historically black colleges that arose because a large percentage of the population at the time that didn't have access to education was black. There was a massive need in those communities for, this is in the era of Jim Crow laws, etc. Right? Segregated America. There's a massive need for people of color to have access to education. And what happened? So again, even without
help me out, are you guys nostalgic for the Jim Crow era? Because
no,
I think we need to.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that at a time when there was significant amount of segregation, there before there were significant subsidies that existed, right? There were solutions that would come to bear. For instance, you had historically black colleges that were funded via
it's called the civil rights movement. Right. Our society indeed rose up and said, that's not good enough. And it changed. And we got to the world that we have today in response to the inequities and injustices. And we still have inequities and injustices. And we have massive.
My point.
Therefore, we need to continue to evolve. But it is not to tear down the institutions we have. It's to learn the lessons of why do they work when they work, and how do we make them work for more?
Right, but the idea, again, what we've done then we have made, I would argue, again, higher education is a nice little example. I would argue that we have made and we have put higher education at many institutions, even state institutions now, well out of the reach of many folks. And again, who gets affected most? It's the disadvantaged community that gets affected.
I'm not sure. Look, you're taking me outside of my area of understanding. I believe that there's a range of schools out there. There are state schools that are, significantly less expensive, community colleges. There is some education, hopefully, that many people can afford. And yes, there are, some schools that are absurdly expensive, and it's not clear to me how much more they offer. But there's a range. And I happen to believe that unlike schools, which don't go generic, their brands don't go generic, though maybe that might be nice if they did, drugs do. They are a manufactured good. I would like us to compare drugs to manufactured goods, and I would like us to recognize that all products that can be commoditized are way more cost effective than the rents extracted from these kinds of service industries, especially the ones that lord their brands over us, whether it be some fancy hospital or university or whatever.
Right. But Peter, the point that the point that I was trying to counter was this idea that if we move to a world where you could, where we didn't have some of the subsidies that inflate prices, we could perhaps get to a point where you had more drugs that are more accessible to more people. Meaning, I don't know. Like even in the 18, like there have been pharmaceutical companies that have
I'm not
existed
willing
for a
to
long
take the
time.
radical. I'm not willing to make the radical changes you guys seem to be advocating, stripping people of
No,
proven benefits of insurance
it's not stripping people
in
of
order to find
insurance.
out.
No,
I'd like
it's
to
not.
protect what we have.
But
Yeah,
what we
no,
have right now is insurance
Right.
that doesn't pay for anything, just precisely because the natural progression of
Yeah.
insurance now is the prices have gone so high that insurance has to force people to pay
Yeah.
out of pocket, and therefore they can't afford anything.
The argument is
right?
how. The argument is how to
Wait.
get access. The argument is how do we give more
Right.
access to more people?
All
And
the
the question is how
outrage
do we
in
get there?
America, all the outrage in America is driven by a minority of people for whom insurance is not working. You cannot ignore the fact that actually, as flawed as America's insurance system is, it's actually working for a lot of people. A lot of people are getting the care they need. Their kids are healthier. Their parents are living longer. They're living more active lives. We can make it work for the fraction of Americans that have been left behind, the ones for whom the out-of-pocket costs are too much, and the 15% of Americans that don't have insurance at all. It is affordable, certainly as far as drug coverage goes, which is my job here. I'm not here to solve the problem that you guys probably know a lot better on the healthcare service side. That's a mess, beyond my comprehension. But on the drug side, the 1.3% of our GDP that is spent on drugs, that we absolutely can make affordable to all Americans who need it. I'll even tell you this. If we could just get insurance to lower out-of-pocket costs, and we can do that with a snap, just like we eliminated pre-existing conditions, you can have Congress pass law that says out-of-pocket cost for drugs cannot be in excess of X, so that it's affordable. There will still be the 15% of Americans who do not have insurance. They're going to pay out-of-pocket for all these drugs? I'll tell you, the drug industry would just give away all of its drugs for free if Congress doesn't, enact laws to prevent it, which perversely they sometimes, toy with that. But basically, the 85% of people with insurance would have insurance that pays for drug prices a little bit more, so that you can subsidize the cost of giving away those drugs for free to the 15% without. I still don't know how those 15% who don't have any, health insurance are going to be able to get routine medical care. They would at least need to go to a doctor, some of these free local community clinics to get a prescription for their free insulin or whatever. And there is, by the way, free insulin. These insulin manufacturers are giving away free insulin to free clinics.
Peter, I was going to actually end with something, but that's a great example of, I totally forgot. I was going to bring it up. I mean, look what the market has given us. And I manage these patients and they come to me because, they're underinsured. They have high out of pocket. And guess what I'm amazed at? I'm amazed that, is it Eli Lilly, or I forget which company has done a deal with Walmart to create the insulin named Relion, which is, an older insulin, but still.
No. Let's not talk about that. That, by comparison to what we have today, that's a poison. I don't know
if it's I don't think a poison is probably the wrong word.
It's my job to take a position that's a little bit, to one side of you on this one. And otherwise, it's
okay. So you're saying
they make their insulin analogs, the modern ones, the good insulins. They make them free.
Yes, I understand. I understand they make them free.
You don't have to get the cheap poison from Walmart. You can get the free insulin from these clinics. You have to be below a certain threshold,
Right, and so these patients that I have a job and they're above those thresholds and don't qualify. Obviously, I mean, I try to get the once a day. I try. Believe me. I mean, my job is to try to get patients who need insulin. So,
so we can take care of the 15% without insurance. We can just give them a free drug until Congress figures out how to extend insurance to them, because they still need it. It's not like I'm going to worry that if we start giving away free drug to the uninsured, everyone in America is like, great, I'm going to drop my insurance. So I don't worry about the unintended consequence of, that kind of, free drugs for the 15%. So we can fix this. All of the angst in America, if we simply get the current insurance plans to reduce out-of-pocket costs for the current drugs, $61 billion in out-of-pocket costs, out of $17 trillion of income. We can spread that across. Plus, there's research that even the Congressional Budget Office supports and has cited that says that if you reduce these out-of-pocket costs, not entirely, there are plenty of people who can afford their out-of-pocket costs, but some fraction, relatively modest fraction of the 61 billion just falls in too big a pile on some people, and it makes adherence to treatment very difficult for them. So they don't adhere and they get worse outcomes. And what the math, the Congressional Budget Office itself has cited, and they tend to be a pretty neutral party, even though sometimes their math really seems to cut against the drug industry. But in this particular case, they said, yeah, if you were to reduce the out-of-pocket costs for patients, it would increase the amount of utilization of drugs, but it would more than offset that expenditure with savings on healthcare services. And so they concluded that reducing out-of-pocket costs for, this was assessment for Medicare, would actually result in savings. And so
Peter, we'll have to bring you back for another podcast where I disagree with that assertion.
Fair enough. Wait, you say you disagree?
Well, this idea
of me back for a podcast where you
we'll have you. We'll definitely have that. This has been a fantastic discussion, and I love your book. Everyone should read it. It's fantastic. I think you make some very clear points. The idea that we are making an investment and these drugs are going generic, and again, it can't be said enough that the American drug industry, which again you're one of the prime movers and shakers of, is the kind of the global innovation hub. And without what folks like you are doing, we'd certainly be in a far worse place. Our disagreement comes in terms of you not having enough faith in the American people to value what you do, regardless of what what other constructs we talk about. Because
I think that I do. It's just a question of how long they would self-organize to come up with an alternative solution. I'm not willing to lose the time, right?
Okay.
It may happen after I have got cobwebs on me and I'm not going to be able to contribute.
You don't have enough faith in the product you're selling. You're selling a great product, and I think people would buy it.
I have faith in the product I'm selling. I don't have faith.
And you don't need the government for it.
All right.
Next
time, guys.
Great. Next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Take care.